Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So on this podcast, we often talk about the dangers of becoming overly reliant on testing protocols and athletes getting very wrapped up in their day-to-day training results or even their testing results, right? A lot of athletes or coaches have some sort of recurring testing protocol where every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or at the end of a training cycle or beginning of a new training cycle, there's tests that we repeat, right? Maybe some 1-rep maxes on some lifts, maybe some certain conditioning workouts that we see as key performance indicators or KPIs for a certain athlete. And in a data-driven sport like CrossFit, it is very important to have some understanding of where athletes sit, what they need to work on, how they're doing relative to their competition. But with this stuff, like I said before, there's some potential dangers of becoming overly wrapped up in or reliant on this data because the sport is always changing and is always kind of messy. But simultaneously, we want to know, okay, what do we actually need to work on? So some of the stuff that we wanted to talk about today has to do with the balance of understanding when testing numbers are really, really important for an athlete, and just some trade-offs that are going to that we're going to have to make, as coaches or as athletes ourselves, between really focusing on improving certain numbers versus just sort of training generally to get better at the sport. So in terms of thinking about the complexity of this, there's differences between what's appropriate for an athlete who is, at the very elite level of the sport, someone who's potentially a CrossFit Games competitor or on the cusp of becoming one, versus someone who's, a high level athlete who isn't necessarily quite at that level but is doing well, versus someone who's, maybe an intermediate level athlete who is looking to do high level competitions and sort of improve themselves, but isn't looking to make a career in the sport, versus someone who's just kind of looking to compete locally and do well in competitions at that scale. So at each of those different stages, the amount of focus on actual testing results and KPIs, like I said before, key performance indicators, is going to change, right? So if we think about, what should athletes at each of those stages be thinking about relative to their testing numbers, and how should coaches be designing testing associated with that? There's a lot of fruitful discussion to be had, and then just some, ways to differentiate what may be appropriate for one type of athlete versus another that can really help make sense of just some of the confusion and noise that I think a lot of people see associated with not just their own testing results, but just the broader let's say environment of constantly seeing numbers from people, constantly seeing stuff being posted online, pulling testing results from open leaderboards, all that kind of stuff. So Luke, I know you wanted to talk a little bit just about, trade-offs and focusing in on specific stuff. So what do you think about that?
So I think that as people start out, I think that testing can be really useful, and what it can do is actually it can make people a lot more objective around their training. It can allow people to have something to work towards, and it can create some level of investment in the process as well. So I think that it can be really, really beneficial to do. But I would say that this is something that you want to do less of as people develop. As people develop, naturally they'll tend to start to play the sport more, and they'll start to be doing things which will be a lot more similar to qualifier scenarios. They may actually be competing more often because they've developed the training volume to be able to withstand that. I think as people do start out, it's important that they go through some structured training. They sort of bring things back down to basics and build a good base. But as people do develop, more elements of the sport are going to be practiced, and things become a little bit more nuanced in how they can actually, move the direction of their training to progress. However, there are definitely certain things that they may actually need to just be able to do. And these can be very, very specific things to competition to actually allow themselves to have more confidence in it. So I'd say that, as people do develop, their training is going to narrow in a lot more on their what is required of the sport just to maintain their abilities in certain areas. But mainly they're going to be working on their training priorities most of the time. For example, I know that Max from Training Think Tank, he said that he constantly has Noah working through absolute strength and his deadlifting ability, and is constantly figuring out ways of working through that. So the sort of training isn't necessarily as general and as broad, because as a beginner you can definitely work on certain things and also at the same time improve in other areas as well, because the training sort of transference is going to be a lot higher. However, if you're an athlete who's looking to compete at a sanctional level, if you're a male athlete and you can't clean 315 pounds, you've got to be able to do that. And we have certain benchmarks that come out through competitions. They usually have, for instance, especially in more local competitions, they'll have like, okay, here's the difference between elite and RX, and these are the things that you need to be able to do and need to be able to hit. But what you would probably find is with a more advanced athlete, those things that they need to be able to hit generally are, one or two things that they are just not able to do if they want to be able to compete at the level they want to. And remember that is what matters. Someone can do really, really well in a testing phase per se, but if they're not necessarily making those improvements in the actual sport and actually when they're competing, then there's definitely questions that need to be asked around about the sort of validity of what they're doing in their training or how they're going about their training.
I think what you brought up at the end there is I've seen that a few times where athletes can test out in a training situation and hit all the right kind of numbers that they need to be hitting, or if they're doing like previous conditioning tests that have been done, say in the open or games workouts or things like that, and they'll hit great numbers, but then on the competition floor they're not able to replicate that. And I think testing on more of a like individual basis, and individual in terms of a specific movement or workout, is not necessarily always going to replicate itself in a competition setting. And I think it's tough as a coach and as an athlete to know how someone is going to perform under the kind of stress and pressure that they get in a competition. But there are ways within a training setting to try and replicate that a little bit, to get a better picture of how that person is going to perform in a competition.
Yeah, like I think that with a beginner or someone who's intermediate, the variables that you have to dial in to improve and improve in a competitive scenario are very few, right? If someone comes in and they're a complete beginner, they just have to look at weights and they get stronger, and they just have to do work to get better. But like you said, if say for instance someone is having, and this is going to be something that you have at the more intermediate to advanced level, and this is when people start counting their macros, when they start thinking about their recovery, they buy a really expensive massage gun, something like that, they're probably going to have to start thinking about how can I replicate competitive scenarios in training. It's about the training progressions going on week to week aren't actually going to be what really gives you that competitive edge. It's actually going to be putting yourself against other people. And it doesn't mean that you have to like practice the flow of a typical, old style regionals games, sanctionals where you're going from like, you've got 5 different barbells set up for your 5 rounds for time. It doesn't mean that, but what it does mean is you need to get used to going against people, being able to try to push yourself, maybe actually instead of thinking about the paces too much, going at a workout, attacking it, and then sort of seeing, what happens and if you're able to hold on, and actually being okay with failing in workouts. Because remember, when you're in training, you're going to be able to learn a lot from those moments where you completely blow up on a workout or on a certain movement. That it's probably best not to do that. And I think a lot of people get too caught up in the idea of not, because the sport itself and training for the sport, because they are the same thing essentially, people get so caught up in the success of training. Training is where you are supposed to miss lifts and where you are supposed to fail. Obviously, this is not how you want to start someone out, but as you do develop, you want to sort of play that game where you are pushing yourself to that point, so you can practice those competitive scenarios.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to some of the things you guys were talking about with, I guess, the loose coupling between testing results and actual performance in competition or events that matter or whatever. And this, I mean, we've talked about this before on this podcast, and this is something that's an ongoing discussion in track and field communities as well. I know we've referenced the On Coaching podcast with Steve Magnus and John Marcus, where they talk a lot about, running results. And this is sort of a thing that they see a lot in their communities, which is people are like, I'm absolutely killing my workouts. I ran my mile repeats at this specific time. I did this crazy 400 meter repeat workout at this specific time. I'm hitting all these numbers, and then they just fail to perform when it comes down to like, okay, cool. Now you have to run a 5K against other people in the rain and, in some sort of adverse condition. And it just doesn't carry over the same way that one would expect. And, if we sort of relate that to some of the ideas that you guys are bringing up of like, hey, listen, we have these testing numbers and they're indicative of something, but it's not necessarily indicative of the ability to do an exact thing in a performance-based setting, right? So if we think about this through the lens of like, okay, we have these different tiers of athletes, we really want to be aware of like, okay, where is a testing scenario really, really, really relevant? And I think the testing scenario is more useful as let's say an indicator over whether or not someone has the capacity to do something at all, which is not necessarily the same thing as are they going to be able to do it in a specific competitive scenario. It's more like, can you do this at all, right? So, if we're talking about someone like you mentioned, Luke, who's, a pretty good athlete who maybe wants to be able to do the open RX or potentially compete at sanctionals should they continue or what have you, right? And it's like, great, you're a male athlete, you can't clean 315. Like, you just got to be able to do that. Does that mean you're going to be able to clean 315 at the end of a workout? Not necessarily. But if your clean is nowhere near that and that's the level you want to compete on, like, okay, that's just going to be something you have to be able to do. And we're going to run testing scenarios to make sure you can do that, right? Similarly, if we have someone who's like, hey, listen, I want to be able to complete all the open workouts RX. I want to be able to do all the workouts without actually getting time capped or whatever. It's like, great, can you do 90 plus chest to bar pull-ups in one workout without completely falling apart and having it take you 30 minutes? If you cannot do that, like, great, you have to be able to do at least 90 chest to bar pull-ups in one workout to be able to probably do the open as prescribed. So, we can create testing scenarios that demonstrate that. If that athlete can do that, does that mean that whatever that crazy descending ladder of thrusters and chest to bar is, right? It ended up being more than 90 reps, but 33, 27, 21, et cetera. Are they going to be able to complete that workout? Was that workout time capped or was that just finish it? 20 minutes. Yeah, I don't remember. But essentially, they may not be able to do that workout, but hopefully if they're able to, hit a certain volume of chest to bar pull-ups in various testing scenarios, it's like, okay, you have the capacity to do this. Now we need to be able to translate that capacity into an actual competitive scenario, right? And then Luke, to your point previously, we can apply that same type of reasoning, particularly well to very, very high level athletes as well. You use the example of Noah Olson and Max El-Haj, where it's like, yo, you're hinging absolute strength is just not where it needs to be relative to the field that you're competing against, right? That you can get very, very specific with an athlete like Noah, who's like, you're going to be a consistent top 10 finisher at the CrossFit Games. And if you can just get these specific things, right, up just a little bit, that may be enough to push you onto the podium consistently and potentially be contending for a top spot. And John, you work with Mary Kay, and it's like, okay, for her, running is something that is just not that fantastic of a let's say movement or whatever, depending on the scenario, right? And it's like, okay, MK, you have to be able to hit these certain running numbers either in just running alone or in a workout potentially involving running and some more CrossFit based stuff. And for her, that's going to actually be relevant because it's like, yo, you can do everything else and you're actually really, really good at it. But if you are not able to hit these times on these running based scenarios, like that's going to be a huge weak spot for you if you are competing at these kinds of events where it matters if you're able to consistently hit top 10 relative to the field over and over and over again, right? But for people who are either not at that elite level or not at that level where it's like, hey, you're trying to potentially take a step from, not doing the open prescribed to doing the open prescribed, or not qualifying in the division that you want to for some sort of sanctioned event versus qualifying, those folks all have like, these are the numbers you have to be able to do. You can't do it, has to be fixed. For people in between, it's tougher, right? Because it's like, you can do everything. You can do big sets of unbroken muscle ups. Your 2K row time trial is pretty good. You do decent decent on these open workouts, but it doesn't all always come together in certain sport specific scenarios. And it's not always clear like, oh, well, if we just improve your max unbroken strict handstand push-ups, you're going to be better at handstand push-ups in a workout. Well, not necessarily, right? Oh, we need to improve your 5-minute AMRAP of power cleans at 225. It's like, yeah, you want to see that number go up, but like, just because that got better, are you going to do better when it's 7-minute AMRAP of ascending power cleans at 225, strict handstand push-ups and double unders? Not always. So the way we think about testing just needs to be calibrated properly for what it can tell us about what an athlete needs. And it's not necessarily going to just be like, oh, you hit this testing number, therefore your performance is going to be at this level.
I think one thing in terms of the thought process behind that is if you think of performance as a pyramid. So at the top, smaller number of people at a higher level of performance. At the bottom, a higher number of people at a lower level of performance. That pyramid kind of mirrors the training needs. So the people at the top of the performance pyramid also have the least number of needs to focus on within their training. The people who are at the bottom, who are kind of a very low level, maybe first time athlete, they have a lot of things that they need to focus on to improve overall as an athlete.
Yeah, and I think that you have one of the biggest things I try to create with beginners is making sure that their training is balanced. Their training priorities are generally very broad. It's okay, we need to increase your absolute strength, we need to increase your aerobic endurance. It's big things like that. And then as people do start to go through, a more individualized training approach for a longer period of time, those priorities tend to be very, very, pretty much centered in the same place, but there's the things become a little bit more specific. So it's like, okay, we now need to develop your squatting absolute strength. We need to get that number up, because that's going to indicate this and this and this. And I think that, one of the things that I often see as well is when people do go through testing and then they go through the training to try and improve that testing, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnection as to why they're doing it or why they're trying to increase that number. So, like you were saying earlier, Todd, is a 5-minute AMRAP of power cleans at 225 actually gonna, improve your ability on, I think it was like 15.3 was the heavy power cleans and handstand push-ups, right? So a workout like that. Or, and sort of bringing it back to the point, the training metric itself is there to demonstrate ability, especially when things are very, very broad. Weightlifters talk about the back squat, overhead squat, and front squat essentially being accessory movements to their Olympic weightlifting movements, which is correct. Obviously, within CrossFit, we do test these things a little bit, but we could use those as a bit of a through a bit of a similar lens. We could say that those movements are there to show us that person has leg strength to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that people have to understand the reason why they're trying to develop a certain thing. And it's not necessarily about just trying to hit the numbers. So if, someone has a 2K rowing protocol and they're going through it and they're just trying to hit those rowing splits on the average number, regardless of how they do it, whether they're just going fast and slow, or whether they're actually holding a consistent pace, you've got to circle it back to what is the goal there. Is the goal to develop your sort of 2K row, or is it to develop your ability to be able to hold consistent rowing splits in something like 19.1 or 18.1, or are we actually just looking to get you better at a 2K row? So I think that people have to be looking at their training over time, and when there are things that you are working on specifically, just remember what it is that you're trying to work on in a more sport-specific scenario. So it's always bringing it back to the sport and not delving too deep into the minutiae of, your energy systems and your strength systems and your skill development and things like that, because the sport is very, very chaotic. We have to be structured, for the majority of the year, but we also have to be, able to handle the chaos. We have to be able to just jump into workouts that we may not be as prepared for as we want to be able to prepare for, because this is what is going to be required when you go to competitions.
So I want to sort of jump into what we were talking about before, just about like trade-offs, right? And it's kind of related to what you were just saying, Luke, where we can run into scenarios where we are focusing on improving specific metrics or specific numbers, and that, everyone has some intuition that there's a trade-off between really, really dialing in strength versus really, really dialing in conditioning or whatever, right? And some of that may be actually physiological. Some of it may just be related to the amount of time that you can spend training and adapting to different stimuluses. But when we're thinking about what the trade-offs are between saying, hey, listen, we need to see whatever your back squat get to this number, and your number of strict pull-ups get to this number, and your snatch and clean and jerk get to this number, how are you guys thinking about what those trade-offs are between focusing on different priorities, and also not just the trade-offs between those different priorities, but the trade-offs between focusing on KPIs and performance numbers versus just kind of like doing the sport, quote unquote, in general?
I mean, I think there's definitely an element of a trade-off, like you say, but I think the higher level you get as an athlete, the less that trade-off becomes. So when you have all these different areas that are all kind of like 85% good, and you have one that's like 60% good, you focusing on that 60% one is going to maybe sacrifice a few percent off each category as you spend more energy and time on that other one. But you can afford to maybe sacrifice a couple of percent to get everything up to 80%. If you're a lower level athlete and everything's at like 30% and you have one thing that's at like 10%, were you sacrificing all the 30% to get that 10% up? And so everything's at 25% is maybe not as beneficial. And a lower level or a newer athlete doesn't necessarily have to sacrifice other things to still improve at things. I think as well, it comes down, when you look at the higher level athletes, it comes down to what they are sacrificing to get that improvement. Is it something like an athlete who isn't good with deadlifts and struggles with deadlifts, and that's the reason why they're not qualifying for sanctional events or not making it to the games? In that situation, yeah, you've got to sacrifice. You've got to be okay with a real posterior chain focused program that is maybe going to cause you to lose some areas, but you're never going to reach that next level of competition without taking a hit in other areas.
Yeah, and I think there's also an important understanding to have with like how those trade-offs actually work, to sort of use a specific example of something that might be related to what you're talking about, John. I mean, this doesn't happen as much anymore, but there used to be a lot of folks who are like, all right, it's the off season, I'm going to get strong, right? And they just sort of stop doing a bunch of conditioning stuff and then follow, specific strength training protocols, often kind of cribbed from powerlifting programs, right? It's like, cool, I'm going to do Smolov, or I'm going to do Smolov Junior, or I'm going to do a West Side cycle, or 5-3-1 or whatever, right? And oftentimes these people would get a lot stronger. In some cases, strength, quote unquote, is their limiting factor in their performance. If you took an inventory of all their testing numbers and their KPIs, it's like, yeah, you know what, your clean and jerk just isn't where it needs to be relative to the people who you're competing against, right? That your back squat number is far too low for you to even be able to hit that 315 clean that Luke was in fact talking about, right? It's like, okay, so you have to get stronger. But the way to do that isn't necessarily to say, cool, I'm just going to go ahead and stop doing my sport in order to improve this KPI. Because then a lot of times I've seen it over and over again, that doesn't actually translate back into the sport. So this person quits doing CrossFit, essentially, right? Does some 5-3-1 protocol or some like bastardization of the Smolov cycle. And it's like, hell yeah, I'm strong as hell. And then, they can now hit this 315 clean, but they can't do 225 squat cleans and toes to bar anymore, right? Because they got stronger, but they lost the adaptation to the sport. And in a lot of cases like this too, it doesn't just mean, oh, cool, well, you sort of sacrifice that and then you'll get your conditioning back in a few weeks just from doing it again. It doesn't always work that way, right? That they've lost that specific adaptation, and then, they end up not being able to integrate it, and then they sort of have to just go backwards on everything in order to regain their capacity in the sport. And it just doesn't work out the way that people think it does. So the trade-offs are tricky and messy, and that it's hard to give a specific recommendation like that, but it's definitely something that athletes and coaches need to be aware of.
Yeah, so I think that you don't want people to get worse at the sport. Obviously, there's people can be out of shape for the sport. They might not necessarily be as sharp as they would be. But I think if you're deciding to move someone's training, or if you're deciding to move your own training in a certain direction, which means that you're not going to be doing X, Y, and Z of something else that's required in the sport. I think that this is very much usually down to people just looking to get stronger, and I think that this is something that just people enjoy training like that, right? I know that I definitely was one of those people that thought that, but I think if you get to the point where you become worse at the sport and you're more than maybe just a single training phase to get back to where you were previously in some of those areas that you got worse in, then I think you've gone too far. So if, say, for instance, you decide to go on this off-season strength program and you're more than 6 weeks away from getting yourself ready for a competition again, then I think you've probably gone too far down that rabbit hole. So, and then obviously whether these things actually translate into the sport, that's another area. But you've got to make sure that you're not getting worse at certain things. And also, if say, for instance, you have say certain skills that you're trying to work on, and you just got them, and then all of a sudden you start to focus on other things because now you've ticked that box. You've just got to understand as well that if you lose that skill, because you've only had it for a short amount of time, it's not as well ingrained that it is probably not going to be coming back as quickly as you want it. You may have to go through a lot of the work that you did previously, and also just understand the effect that has on someone's confidence in their ability to go out and perform. I think that maybe just going through something that's just a little bit is just trying to find whatever that minimum effective dose is, and just trying to make sure that someone is trying to use just the minimum amount of training stress required to bring up a certain area. You don't have to just make these really brash generalizing statements that I am a weak athlete, or I am a slow athlete, or I need to have an engine or something like that. It's about really just trying to make sure that you just improve this area over here a little bit, this area over here a little bit. Make sure that you keep practicing the sport just enough so you don't get used to it. I know you've said this before, but I think that, as soon as you're away from just a training phase or a peaking phase as such, to getting back to where you were previously, or what you would consider your baseline is, you've gone too far down there and you've probably made too many trade-offs.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.